Mrs. Carter? This is Attorney William Hayes from Bar Harbor, Maine. We need to discuss the coastal property your husband left behind. My son looked up from the kitchen table so quickly that his coffee nearly spilled. For a second, the entire house went silent except for the ticking clock above the stove. I tightened my grip around the phone and forced my voice to stay calm. I think you have the wrong number, I said quietly before ending the call. Daniel stared at me from across the table, confusion already spreading across his face. Rebecca stopped halfway through scrolling on her phone. Even from where I sat, I could feel her attention sharpen like a knife. What property in Maine? Daniel asked slowly. I folded the dish towel in my lap and kept my eyes on the window above the sink. Outside, late October rain slid down the glass in thin gray streams. Nothing important, I replied. Just some old paperwork from years ago. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, her expression carefully neutral, but I knew that look. I had seen it before at family dinners whenever money came up. Whenever someone mentioned inheritances or investments or real estate prices climbing along the East Coast. George never mentioned property in Maine, she said lightly. Too lightly. Your father mentioned many things over 40 years of marriage, I answered. Not all of them mattered. Daniel frowned. My son had his father's eyes, soft blue and thoughtful, but lately they always looked tired around me, as if visiting his widowed mother had become another responsibility squeezed between conference calls and mortgage payments. 6 months earlier, when George died from heart failure at 74, Daniel promised he would check on me every week. The first month, he called often. By the third month, the calls became shorter. By the sixth, most of our conversations happened because Rebecca reminded him. I could tell. A mother always can. Rebecca stood and walked toward the refrigerator with casual movements that felt overly practiced. Well, she said, property in Maine sounds pretty important to me. I said nothing. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon from the muffins I had baked that morning, but suddenly the warmth of the room felt gone. My eyes drifted toward the old wooden cabinet near the hallway. Inside, beneath stacks of winter blankets and photo albums, sat a small brass key George had hidden there years ago. Even now, after all this time, I could still hear his voice the night he placed it into my hand. Promise me something, Evelyn, he had whispered. Don't tell Daniel about the house until you're absolutely sure he remembers what family means. At the time, I thought grief medication and exhaustion were making him speak strangely. George had always adored our son. Even during Daniel's most selfish years, George defended him. But near the end of his life, something had changed. He started watching people more carefully, especially Rebecca. Mom, Daniel's voice pulled me back to the present. Was Dad hiding something from me? I finally looked at him then. Not at Rebecca, just my son. The little boy who used to collect seashells with his father every summer along the Maine shoreline. The boy who once cried because he accidentally stepped on a sand crab. I wondered where that gentle child had gone. Your father believed some things should be protected, I said softly. Rebecca closed the refrigerator door harder than necessary. Protected from who? She asked. I smiled faintly and reached for my tea. That, I said, is exactly what your father spent his last year trying to figure out. That night, after Daniel and Rebecca left, I stood alone in the kitchen long after the tea had gone cold. Their coffee mug still sat on the table beside a plate of untouched muffins. Rebecca had spent the last 20 minutes before leaving pretending not to care about Maine, but I noticed every small detail. The way she casually asked whether George ever traveled alone. The way she tried to sound relaxed while asking if property taxes near the coast were expensive. The way Daniel kept glancing at me, searching my face for answers I was not ready to give him. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows as I carried the dishes to the sink. The house felt too large at night now. George used to hum old Frank Sinatra songs while locking the back door before bed. Sometimes he forgot the words halfway through and made up the rest. I used to laugh every time. Now the silence inside the house felt heavy enough to hear. I dried my hands slowly and walked toward the hallway cabinet. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it and reached beneath the folded blankets. The brass key still rested exactly where I had hidden it. Small, dull with age, ordinary to anyone else. But George once told me that some of the most important things in life were meant to look unimportant. I sat down in the living room chair beside the lamp he used every evening to read. For a long moment, I simply stared at the key resting in my palm. Then my eyes drifted toward the photograph above the fireplace. George and Daniel stood together on the rocky shoreline in Maine almost 15 years earlier. Daniel could not have been older than 27. His jeans were rolled to his knees, and both of them were laughing about something outside the frame. Back then, my son still called every Sunday without being reminded. Back then, Rebecca was not yet part of our lives. The first time George met her, he shook her hand politely and smiled the entire evening. But later that night, after she left, he sat quietly at the edge of our bed much longer than usual. "She notices things too quickly," he said finally. I remember laughing softly. "What does that even mean?" He stared toward the bedroom window for several seconds before answering. "It means she walks into a room and immediately sees what everyone owns." At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Rebecca was ambitious, organized, confident. She came from a family that struggled financially, and I assumed her carefulness around money came from growing up without security. But over the years, small moments began collecting like drops of rain filling a bucket. She always asked how much things cost. She remembered every detail about inheritances in other families. She once spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner talking about property values while George quietly pushed food around his plate. And near the end of his life, after his second hospital stay, he started asking strange questions. Late at night, "If something happens to me," he whispered once, "would Daniel still come visit you if there was nothing left to inherit?" I became angry when he said that. I accused him of being cynical, tired, emotional from medication. George only nodded and looked away. Now, sitting alone in the dim living room, I realized something painful. He had not been afraid of death. He had been afraid of what death would reveal about the people we loved most. My phone suddenly vibrated on the side table, startling me. A text message from Rebecca appeared on the screen. "I hope I did not upset you earlier. I just think Daniel deserves to know everything about his father." I stared at the message for a very long time before locking the phone without replying. Then I looked back down at the brass key in my hand and whispered softly into the empty room, "I still do not know if he does." 3 days passed before I heard from Daniel again. Not a phone call, not a visit, just a short text message asking if I wanted to come over for dinner on Sunday night. I knew immediately it was Rebecca's idea. Daniel hated uncomfortable conversations. Even as a little boy, he used to disappear into his room whenever tension filled the house. George always said our son had a soft heart but weak instincts. At the time, I thought that sounded too harsh for a child. Now I understood exactly what he meant. Sunday evening arrived cold and windy. Dry leaves scraped across the sidewalks as I drove 30 minutes north to Daniel's neighborhood. Their subdivision looked almost identical to every other upper middle-class development outside Boston. Large gray houses, bright porch lights, expensive SUVs parked in neat driveways. Everything looked polished from the outside, empty in a way I could never explain. Rebecca greeted me at the door with a warm smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You made it," she said as she kissed the air beside my cheek. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen. Soft jazz music played through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Every detail felt carefully arranged. Too carefully arranged. Daniel hugged me quickly before returning to uncork a bottle of wine. He looked nervous already. We sat down at the dining table beneath a chandelier Rebecca once bragged cost nearly $4,000. During dinner, the conversation stayed shallow at first. Work, weather, traffic near downtown. Rebecca talked about a couple in their neighborhood selling a vacation property for almost $2 million. I noticed how casually she mentioned the number before glancing toward me. "Real estate in coastal towns is unbelievable right now," she said while cutting her chicken, "especially places with ocean views." I took a sip of water but said nothing. Daniel shifted in his chair. "Mom," he said carefully, "about the other day," Rebecca interrupted gently. "We are just worried you might be overwhelmed handling everything alone after George passed." There it was. Not concern. Positioning. I had heard that tone before from people trying to gain access to something they believed belonged to them. "I manage just fine," I answered quietly. Rebecca smiled again. "Of course you do. But secrets can create misunderstandings in families." The word secrets hung in the air longer than it should have. Daniel lowered his eyes toward his plate. He hated conflict so much that he often mistook silence for peace. I looked around the dining room slowly. Framed family photos covered the walls, but I noticed something strange. There were dozens of pictures from Rebecca's side of the family. Vacations, birthdays, weddings. Yet only 2 photos included George, and neither one was recent. That realization settled heavily inside my chest. George used to say that people reveal what matters most by what they display proudly. Suddenly, I understood why he grew quieter every year after Daniel married her. After dinner, Rebecca offered dessert while Daniel carried plates into the kitchen. The moment he disappeared around the corner, her smile faded almost instantly. "I think you should know something," she said softly while folding her napkin. "Daniel has been under a lot of pressure financially." I looked at her carefully. "Many families are these days." She nodded slowly. "Exactly. Which is why hidden property could change everything for him. Not for us. Not for the family. For him." I noticed she did not mention memories. Or George. Or grief. Only value. Only opportunity. I leaned back in my chair and studied her face for a long moment. Then I asked quietly, "Rebecca, have you ever been to Maine?" She blinked, slightly surprised. "No." "Then you would not understand why George wanted that place left alone." For the first time all evening, something cold flickered behind her eyes. Just for a second. But it was enough. Because suddenly I realized Rebecca was no longer simply curious about the house. She had already decided it belonged to her future. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and could not fall back asleep. The house creaked softly in the cold the way old homes do in late November. For years, George used to wake first and start coffee before I even stepped out of bed. Sometimes I still listened for the sound of the grinder downstairs. Grief was strange that way. It trained your heart to expect someone long after they were gone. I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and walked quietly into George's old study. Very little had changed since the funeral. His reading glasses still rested beside the lamp. A faded Red Sox cap hung near the door. Even the faint smell of cedar and old paper remained trapped inside the room, like time itself had stopped there. I sat down carefully at his desk and opened the bottom drawer where he kept important documents. Most of it had already been handled after his passing. Insurance papers, bank accounts, medical records. But hidden beneath an old fishing magazine sat a small brown notebook I had not seen before. My fingers hesitated before opening it. George rarely wrote things down unless they mattered deeply to him. The first pages contained ordinary notes, hardware measurements, grocery reminders, tide schedules from Bar Harbor. Then, halfway through the notebook, I found Rebecca's name written several times beside short dates. My chest tightened immediately. I turned the page slowly. March 12th. Rebecca asked detailed questions about the Maine taxes. Another page. April 3rd. Daniel mentioned selling and used property before I was even discharged from the hospital. Another. May 19th. Rebecca said memories do not pay utility bills. I stared at those words for a long time. George had noticed everything. Quietly. Carefully. Without confrontation. That was the kind of man he had always been. He believed people eventually revealed themselves if given enough time. Near the back of the notebook, one final entry stopped me cold. If Evelyn is reading this someday, it means I was right to protect the house. I closed my eyes for several seconds. Outside, wind rattled branches against the windows. Suddenly, I remembered something from the final summer before George died. We had been sitting on the porch in Maine watching fog roll across the water. Daniel and Rebecca were supposed to visit that weekend, but canceled at the last minute because Rebecca wanted to attend a networking event in New York. George did not seem disappointed. If anything, he looked relieved. "Do you ever think people confuse value with worth?" he asked me that evening. I laughed softly because it sounded like one of his old philosophy questions. "Probably," I answered. He looked toward the ocean and nodded. "That little house is worth almost nothing compared to the properties around it now. But it has value they will never understand." At the time, I thought he meant emotional value, memories, family history. But now, sitting alone in his study with the notebook trembling slightly in my hands, I realized he meant something else entirely. The house was a test, not of greed alone, but of patience, loyalty, love. My phone buzzed suddenly on the desk, breaking the silence. A new message from Daniel appeared. Rebecca found old property records online. "Mom, why was Dad still paying taxes there?" I stared at the screen without answering. A second message arrived almost immediately afterward. Was he planning to leave it to me? I looked down at George's notebook once more. Then I slowly closed it and whispered into the quiet room. That was never the question your father cared about. 2 days later, Rebecca called me for the first time in months without Daniel being part of the conversation. I noticed that immediately. Usually, when she contacted me, it was through group messages about birthdays or holiday dinners or reminders to bring something for family gatherings. But that Tuesday afternoon, her name appeared alone on my phone screen while I was folding laundry in the guest room. I let the call ring twice before answering. "Hello, Rebecca." Her voice sounded unusually soft. "Hi, Evelyn. I hope I am not bothering you." I glanced out the window at the bare maple trees swaying in the cold wind. "No. What is it?" A brief silence followed. Then came the careful kindness people use when they want something. "I have been thinking about what you said the other night," she began. "About George wanting the house left alone." I said nothing. "I just feel like maybe there has been some misunderstanding between all of us," she continued. "Daniel has been really emotional lately." Emotional. Not grieving. Not confused. Emotional. Rebecca always chose words that quietly shifted blame away from herself. "Your husband loved that place very much," she added. "Maybe it would help Daniel heal if he could see it." I slowly placed another towel onto the folded stack beside me. "Heal from what exactly?" I asked. She paused longer this time. "From losing his father." I closed my eyes briefly. George had been gone 6 months, and during that entire time Daniel visited Maine exactly 0 times. He never asked about the shoreline. Never asked whether I still kept George's fishing jacket by the back door. Never asked if the old lighthouse diner was still open. But suddenly, now that property records existed online, healing had become urgent. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "have you ever wondered why George never brought you there?" The line went quiet. I could almost hear her thinking. "I assumed it was private," she answered carefully. "It was," I replied. "Very private." Before she could continue, another voice entered faintly in the background. "Daniel." "Did she say anything?" he asked, his voice muffled. Rebecca covered the phone for a second, but not quickly enough. That single moment told me more than the entire conversation. They were sitting together, planning together, searching together. I looked down at the half-folded blanket in my lap and suddenly remembered another winter nearly 20 years earlier. Daniel had just graduated college and drove to Maine with George during Christmas break. They spent 3 days repairing storm damage on the little house after heavy coastal winds shattered part of the porch railing. When they returned home, George could not stop smiling. "He worked beside me the entire time," he told me proudly. "Never complained once." That memory hurt now because somewhere over the years, my son stopped seeing the house as a place. And people who stop seeing places emotionally eventually start measuring them financially. Rebecca's voice pulled me back again. "Maybe we could all go together," she suggested. "Just for closure." Closure. Another carefully selected word. I walked slowly toward the hallway cabinet where the brass key remained hidden beneath the blankets. "I will think about it," I answered. Rebecca sounded relieved immediately. "Really?" "Yes," I said softly. "But before anyone goes to Maine, there is something Daniel deserves to understand first." "What is that?" she asked quickly. My fingers closed gently around the old brass key as I stared into the dim hallway shadows. "The house was never the inheritance your father intended to leave behind." The trip to Maine happened 1 week later. Rebecca insisted on driving together as a family, and Daniel agreed too quickly, as if he believed proximity alone could repair something already cracking beneath the surface. I sat quietly in the back seat for most of the 8-hour drive, while gray November skies followed us north along the interstate. Rebecca spent much of the trip talking about rising coastal property values in New England. She tried to make it sound casual, but every few miles another question slipped out. "Do people rent vacation homes up there during summer? Are there restaurants nearby? Is the land large?" Daniel occasionally told her to slow down, though never firmly enough to matter. I spent most of the drive watching the trees change as we crossed deeper into Maine. Pines replaced crowded highways. The air itself seemed different there. Cleaner, colder, honest in a way cities no longer felt. We arrived just after sunset. The ocean appeared first between gaps in the trees, dark and endless beneath the fading sky. Then the little house finally came into view at the end of the gravel road. Rebecca's silence told me immediately she had expected something else. The house was small, white paint faded by salt air, a narrow porch facing the water, no gates, no luxury landscaping, no massive windows overlooking cliffs. Just an old coastal home weathered by decades of storms and summers and quiet mornings. Daniel stepped out slowly, staring toward the porch like he had forgotten something important and painful all at once. "I remember this place," he whispered. His voice sounded younger suddenly. Softer. I unlocked the front door with the brass key while cold wind rolled in from the shoreline, carrying the smell of salt and pine. Inside, everything remained almost exactly as George left it. The old plaid blanket folded beside the fireplace. Fishing books stacked near the couch. Family photographs lining the hallway walls. Rebecca walked through the rooms carefully, her expression becoming harder to read with every passing minute. I think she expected hidden luxury beneath the simplicity. Instead, she found memories. Daniel stopped in front of a faded photograph hanging beside the kitchen doorway. He laughed quietly under his breath. "Dad took this after I caught my first lobster trap," he said. I was terrified to touch it. I watched his face closely then. For the first time in months, he looked fully present instead of distracted by deadlines and phone notifications and adult obligations. The house was pulling something old out of him. Something Rebecca did not seem to understand. She opened cabinets, checked windows, measured spaces with her eyes. Not greedily exactly. More like someone trying to calculate invisible numbers. "It is smaller than I imagined," she finally admitted. "Your father loved that," I answered softly. He said small places forced people to notice each other. Later that evening, while Daniel started a fire in the stone fireplace, I stood alone in the kitchen unpacking groceries. Rebecca entered quietly behind me. I looked up the property. "Records before we came," she said in a low voice. "I kept arranging Kent's soup onto the counter without turning around. I assumed you did." She hesitated. "The land itself is worth much more than the house." There it was again. Not the memories. Not George. Not Daniel reconnecting with pieces of himself he had nearly forgotten. Only worth. I finally looked at her then. "Do you know what George loved most about this place?" I asked. She crossed her arms lightly. "What?" I glanced toward the living room, where Daniel sat staring into the fire with tired blue eyes that suddenly reminded me so much of his father that it almost hurt to look at him. The fact that people eventually revealed who they truly were here. The storm rolled in sometime after midnight. I woke to the sound of wind pushing against the old windows and waves crashing harder along the rocks below the bluff. For a moment, lying beneath heavy blankets in the upstairs bedroom, I forgot George was gone. Every autumn storm in Maine used to feel the same. He would wake before sunrise, make coffee, and stand on the porch wrapped in his old wool coat watching the ocean churn beneath the gray sky. Then reality settled over me again, cold and familiar. I slipped quietly from bed and walked downstairs. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. A faint orange glow still flickered inside the fireplace where dying embers warmed the living room. Daniel sat alone on the couch, staring into the fire. "You are up early," I said gently. He looked over his shoulder, surprised. "Could not sleep." I nodded and walked into the kitchen to start coffee. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence between us no longer felt angry, just uncertain. "I forgot how loud the ocean gets here during storms," he finally said. "Your father loved that sound." Daniel stared down at his hands. "I used to love it too." I carried 2 mugs back into the living room and handed him one. His face looked tired in the dim firelight. "Older than 42. Mom," he asked carefully, "why did Dad stop bringing us here?" The question settled heavily inside me because I knew the answer. George did not stop bringing Daniel to Maine because he stopped loving him. He stopped because each visit became harder after Rebecca entered the picture. The arguments about time away from work. The complaints about weak internet service. The comments about wasted property value. Little by little, the peace George protected here started disappearing. But I could not say all of that aloud. Not yet. "Your father believed some places should stay untouched by certain parts of life," I answered quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. Before he could ask another question, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. We both looked toward the ceiling. Footsteps followed quickly. Then another sound. A sliding scrape above us. My stomach tightened instantly. Daniel stood first and headed toward the staircase. I followed close behind. We found Rebecca in the attic beneath a hanging light bulb, kneeling beside an open wooden trunk covered in dust. Papers and old photographs surrounded her across the floorboards. She froze the moment she saw us. Daniel stared in confusion. "What are you doing up here?" Rebecca stood too quickly. I was just looking around. But the expression on her face was not curiosity anymore. It was urgency. I noticed immediately what sat beside her knee. A small iron lockbox George kept hidden in the attic for years. My pulse slowed strangely instead of speeding up, because suddenly I understood exactly what George had predicted. Rebecca glanced between us before speaking carefully. The lock was already broken. It was a lie. George built that box himself 20 years earlier after a storm damaged the original attic storage chest. Daniel stepped closer to the scattered papers on the floor. Most were old utility bills and fishing permits. Then he noticed the envelope resting partly beneath the box lid. His name was written across the front in George's handwriting. Daniel's entire expression changed. Slowly, he picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. Rebecca opened her mouth slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. Daniel looked at me once before carefully opening the letter. As his eyes moved across the page, the color slowly drained from his face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he whispered, quietly into the cold attic air, "Dad knew." The attic stayed completely silent except for the sound of rain striking the roof overhead. Daniel stood frozen beneath the dim hanging bulb, holding George's letter with both hands as though it weighed far more than paper should. Rebecca shifted beside the open lockbox, her face pale now in a way I had never seen before. Not embarrassed, not guilty, cornered. Daniel swallowed hard before finally reading aloud. "If you are opening this because you came searching for ownership instead of memories, then you already misunderstood why this house exists." His voice cracked slightly on the final word. I closed my eyes for a moment because hearing George's thoughts spoken aloud after all these months felt almost unbearable. Daniel continued reading more slowly. "The ocean teaches people something cities never do. You cannot control everything. You cannot measure everything. And the people who spend their lives calculating value often lose the ability to recognize what is priceless." Rebecca crossed her arms tightly. "That does not mean anything," she said too quickly. Daniel ignored her and kept reading. "If Rebecca is standing beside you while you read this, I hope you ask yourself one difficult question. Did she encourage you to come here because she loves this family? Or because she believes something valuable was hidden from her?" Rebecca's face hardened instantly. "That is unfair," she snapped. "Your father barely knew me." I finally looked directly at her. George knew people better than anyone I have ever met. The wind outside howled sharply against the house, rattling the old attic windows. Daniel lowered the letter slowly, his expression unraveling piece by piece. "Dad really thought that about us," he whispered. I stepped closer carefully. "Not about you," I answered softly. "About what you were becoming." Rebecca let out a bitter laugh under her breath. "This is unbelievable. We drove 8 hours for some emotional test." Daniel turned toward her, confusion spreading across his face. "What do you mean test?" She hesitated only briefly before speaking. "Daniel, come on. This place is falling apart. Your father obviously turned it into some kind of lesson because he did not trust anyone." The moment the words left her mouth, I saw something shift inside my son. Not anger. Worse, recognition. Because suddenly he realized Rebecca was still talking about the house as an object while George had spent years trying to preserve it as something human. Daniel looked back down at the letter. Another folded page slipped loose from the envelope onto the dusty floorboards. I picked it up before Rebecca could reach it first. My breath caught immediately when I saw George's handwriting again. Legal instructions. Dates. Signatures. Daniel stared at me. "Mom." Slowly, I handed him the document. His eyes moved across the page faster this time. Then he looked up sharply. "The house. It is not ours anymore." Rebecca stepped forward immediately. "What?" Daniel reread the page in disbelief. "Dad transferred the property into a trust 6 months before he died." The room suddenly felt colder. Rain hammered harder against the roof while Rebecca grabbed the document from his hands. Her eyes scanned the page frantically. "Retreat center?" she whispered. "For widows." I leaned against an old wooden beam and watched realization settle across both their faces differently. Rebecca looked stunned because the financial future she imagined had vanished instantly. But Daniel looked devastated for another reason entirely. He finally understood the truth. George had not hidden the house out of spite. He hid it because he saw what greed was quietly doing to the people he loved. Rebecca looked up at me sharply. "You knew about this?" I nodded once. Your father wanted this place to become somewhere people could heal after loss. Daniel sank slowly onto an old trunk beneath the window, staring down at the letter in his hands. Outside, the storm rolled endlessly across the dark Atlantic coastline. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, my son asked the question George had feared for years. Was there ever a moment Dad still believed I would understand? 1 year later, the little house in Maine no longer belonged to our family in the way people usually mean when they talk about ownership. The brass plaque near the front porch now read, "The George Carter Retreat House." Every month, widows from across New England came there for quiet weekends beside the ocean. Some arrived carrying grief so heavy it bent their shoulders forward. Others arrived simply exhausted from spending years caring for everyone except themselves. They sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee at sunrise. They walked the shoreline collecting smooth stones. They talked softly beside the fireplace George built with his own hands nearly 30 years earlier. And somehow, the house still felt exactly like him. I visited once every few months to help organize donations and prepare rooms before winter seasons. The trust board insisted on paying me for my time, but I always refused. Being there was enough. The house no longer felt haunted by loss. It felt useful, peaceful, alive in a quiet way. Daniel had not returned since the stormy night in the attic. At least not while I was there. After we left Maine that weekend, something inside him changed permanently. For several weeks, he called me often. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes during his lunch breaks. Our conversations felt awkward at first, like two people trying to rebuild a bridge after years of neglect. He asked questions about his father constantly. Small things. What books George liked rereading. Which Sinatra songs he hummed most often. Why he always preferred old wool sweaters instead of buying new coats. I answered every question patiently because I realized my son was trying to find the version of himself his father once believed in. Rebecca, however, disappeared almost entirely. I never asked for details about their marriage, and Daniel never volunteered much. But I noticed he stopped saying "we" during conversations. Eventually, months later, he admitted they were living separately. I keep replaying everything in my head. He told me quietly one evening over the phone. I do not even know when I stopped noticing what mattered. I wanted to tell him that life often changes people gradually, not dramatically. That losing yourself rarely feels sudden while it is happening. But instead, I simply listened. Because some realizations hurt more when another person tries to soften them. Late one December afternoon, I arrived at the retreat house after fresh snowfall covered the coastline in white. The ocean looked steel gray beneath heavy clouds, and smoke curled gently from the chimney. I smiled immediately because someone had arrived before me and already started a fire inside. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed a familiar pickup truck parked beside the road. Daniel stood near the railing facing the water with both hands buried inside his coat pockets. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Snowflakes drifted slowly between us and the cold air. He looked older than the year before. Quieter too, but not empty anymore. I did not know if you would come today, he admitted softly. I walked beside him and looked out toward the waves crashing against the rocks below. Your father always said winter was the most honest season here. Daniel nodded faintly. I think I finally understand what he meant. We stood there together listening to the ocean for a long time. No arguments. No discussions about money. No questions about ownership. Just silence and salt air and the sound of waves George once loved. Finally, Daniel looked toward the house glowing warmly behind us and asked quietly, "Do you think Dad would have forgiven me?" I stared out across the endless gray Atlantic before answering. I think your father spent the end of his life hoping you would forgive yourself before it became too late.